go ahead and, tell us a little bit more about yourself, and what you're going to do.
Okay, well, I was a photographer for many years. I came out of San Jose State College, by the way. I was a member of the very last graduating class from San Jose State College before it became San Jose State University. So I feel pretty good about that. I have one of the very few last diplomas that say that. And I came out in photojournalism and went to work for some magazines in Los Angeles, and then went to work for newspapers in Omaha, Nebraska, and then came back here to the Fremont area and started working for a group of newspapers here. And there I became the chief photographer and director of photography after a while. And eventually, of course, I moved on and started running my own studio, and I was also teaching photography at Chabot College and at De Anza College, where I also taught Photoshop. And I had a studio for many years, and I gave classes in my studio through meetup.com. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a way for folks to get together over subjects that they like. Mine, of course, was about the meetup that I ran was about photography. And over the course of a few years, my meetup became pretty popular. I had 2,000 members in my meetup group. And over the course of a couple of years, I gave 200 sessions, training sessions in my class, in my studio. So between teaching professional photographers while I was a chief photographer, and teaching college students and teaching many classes, I've got a lot of experience teaching, which is what I'm about to do tonight. In fact, I'm still teaching for the city of Fremont, teaching photography classes for the Fremont Recreation Department. So it's an ongoing effort.
So anyway, to get started, you can share your screen.
All righty.
Steve,
Yes.
from Joel and Tricia are,
Oh,
and so is Ellen.
and do any of the three of you have something to say before Len starts his presentation?
I apologize for being late. We were doing home repair projects and completely lost track of time.
Well, we were just talking about home repair.
Well, specifically in a carpet. We just finished up, so we're recovering from that. But my suggestion is just let Len get into his presentation, and maybe we'll say something afterwards. Just go around the room.
Very good. So Len,
Right.
Ooh,
very good.
There it is. So I'm here tonight to talk about intentional camera movement, and also I'll be talking about multiple exposures. Intentional camera movement is probably well, it's certainly the more difficult to accomplish part of, oddly enough, the more difficult part to accomplish than multiple images, but multiple images takes more steps. Anyway, a ground rule, an inescapable ground rule in intentional camera movement is the fact that you need a relatively long exposure, relatively slow shutter speed. Anything shorter than 1/8 of a second, for example, is going to produce so little movement as to barely qualify as intentional camera movement. The rule is, I think we probably all heard of Sunny 16. Sunny 16 means that in direct sun, the basic exposure with your camera is f16 over with a shutter speed of 1 over the ISO. So whatever your ISO is set at, that number is the denominator in that shutter speed fraction. So f16 at 1 over the ISO. If you've got ISO 100, that means f16 at 100th of a second. Well, that's that's just too short. It's just too short an exposure for intentional camera movement. So then you can stop down to f22, yeah, and you're only at a 50th of a second. You're only at a 50th of a second. Well, how are we going to cope with that then? What are we going to do? We have to turn to hardware. We have to turn to our hardware. And in smartphones, that's one kind of hardware, smartphones. In smartphones, what we do is use an app. We use apps. The iPhone has lots of apps. Yay. iPhone has lots of apps with which you can practice intentional camera movement. The app that's in use that I'm about to use here is called Spectre, like in the James Bond movies. Spectre, like the ghost. SPECTRE, Spectre is the app that I'm using here. And when you use Spectre, even in sunlight, it allows you to have what looks like a long exposure. And you wind up with this when you shake the camera, when you shake the phone. This is an example of moving the phone from side to side. And how does the app do this? Because you may be already familiar with the fact that smartphones don't have an aperture. They don't have an aperture control. They only have wide open. That's it. f1.8. Wow. So if you have to use f22 or how do you do this? Well, here is the giveaway. Here is how you can tell how they do it. Let me get up to the navigator here. Oh, look, you see these vertical lines here? As I'm moving the camera from side to side, the camera is taking a whole bunch of pictures, click, 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 but you don't hear it. It's just doing it in software, doing it in the sensor. And it's taking dozens of pictures at a very short shutter speed. Look at all these pictures up here. This post is being photographed over and over and over and over. And as it's being photographed in all those brief exposures, you wind up with what appears to be a blurred time exposure, or a long blurred exposure. That's how that's how the iPhone does it. Well, is there a difference with the Android? Well, yes, there is a difference with the Android. The Android cannot do that at all. There's no app with the Android that allows you to do that. So when you have a subject like this and you're using an iPhone type camera, you get telltale signs. When you have a subject like this and you use the iPhone camera, you're probably going to be more successful. And so you wind up with this instead, and you don't see those telltale vertical lines. Now, this is an example of using the camera and sliding it sideways by sliding. Can you see me up here in the thumbnails?
Mhm.
Well, there's a couple of different approaches to camera movement, and one of them is called a truck. And that is you're sliding the camera along like it's a truck moving past you or moving past the subject. Another camera movement is one where you turn the camera from side to side like that. I'll show with a camera also. Up. This is a little more. When you turn the camera from side to side like this, that's called a pan. There are advantages and disadvantages to both kinds of movements. In any case, with smartphones, you can get an app that will imitate a long shutter speed with the iOS, and with Android, you can't get that, which actually has an advantage. There's an advantage to it. So here's, let's see. Here is what I showed you what the iOS looks like. Here's what an actual camera looks like when you do it. So here the shutter speed is about a half second. Now with cameras and with Androids, it's much more difficult to get slow shutter speeds in daylight. It is very difficult to get slow shutter speeds in daylight. Again, because of the Sunny 16 rule, most cameras don't go below the lenses, that is, you can't set them at a smaller aperture than f/22. Some lenses go to f/32, but most lenses are going to stop you at f/22. So that kind of limits what you're doing. So the next thing you need to do, next decision you have to make is how are you going to limit the light, reduce the light coming into the camera so that you can get that long shutter speed? Well, in order to reduce the light coming into the camera, you use a neutral density filter. It's just a filter that is like your sunglasses, only way denser. These filters are so dense that it looks like there's no light at all coming through them almost. They come in a variety of densities. I'm going to make a change in applications here in just a second. Okay, is this easy enough to see here?
Yep.
Okay, so N neutral density filters are given numbers, and a typical neutral density filter is one that goes from 2 to f/32. So the filter is rated at 2 to 32. So when you go to buy a filter, then that's the rating that it has. And at f32, it reduces the light coming into the lens by the equivalent of 5 f-stops, 5 f-stops. Well, what that means, again, ISO 100, when we're looking at ISO 100, see, at f16, by reducing it 5 stops, at f16, the exposure that you'd be looking at, the most you would expose it would be half a second. You could easily get away with a full second. If there's any haze, or this is for direct sun at noon, if it isn't noon or if there's any haze or light overcast, then you can immediately go to 2 seconds of exposure, 2 seconds of exposure at f16. So that's what a 2 to 32 would give you. And when you're using the filter, now I'm going to change back. When you're using the filter, I made a mistake. I'm going to be right back. I apologize.
No worries.
I brought a bunch of cameras in, but not quite the right one. So here you can see a neutral density filter on the face of the lens. Oh, I'm reflecting my ring light in it. Looks pretty fancy. So, but of course it's just a dark filter, and it screws onto the front of the lens. And we can see that it is very dark indeed. So it also has I think I'll try this. A little bit bigger here. It also has a ring. You see this value right here is changing?
Mhm.
As I turn the ring, it can vary from 2 to 32, from 2 to 32. So that gives me plenty of range. So right here, stops of loss, if I have it set at 2, I'm only cutting out 1 stop of light. So that helps me a lot when at twilight, for example, and then 2 stops of light and so forth. All these different stops of light are good for different light values in the scene. So I can bring the light values down to where I can use something like a half second. These are the times in here that I really want to be using 2 seconds, 1 second, half second. Those are the times that I really want to be using. And this filter will give me those times in a really wide variety of environmental circumstances. So very handy. So here is a picture shot with a camera. So this was shot with a camera, and the shutter speed on this is 4/10 of a second, about a half second. Shutter speed is about a half second on this picture. So we can see that the blur it's definitely a blur. We have rendered the subject abstract, or just about abstract, but at a half second, it doesn't offer a lot of blur. Oh boy. Now, we change the exposure time a little bit, and we change how fast I'm moving the camera. So actually, the exposure time is the same. It's about a half second, but I'm moving the camera much faster, sweeping the camera past the subject much faster, so that it stretches out the highlights a lot more. And again, I'm moving the camera even faster. And these exposures are in cloudy weather, overcast. It's outdoors during the day, late in the morning, and it's overcast here. And so there is daylight, but not much by comparison to direct sun. Now I made a change, and this is direct sun. And again, I'm working with a camera, and ISO 100, and the exposure here is 4/10 of a second, or half second. And this is the subject. Okay, the subject looks like this. So as I sweep past it, right, as I sweep past it, I can now change, and I have changed the value on the neutral density filter to 10. I'm all the way up to 10. And so now the exposure is 3.5 seconds. So I'm sweeping the camera past this subject at 3.5 seconds. And this is what you wind up with. So that gives you an idea. This is 4/10 of a second, and you see how long the red highlights are. This is 3.5 seconds. And you see the red highlights are they're really stretched out now. Again, 3.5 seconds. And now I'm moving the camera very fast. There's two things happening here. One is I'm moving the camera here in the truck fashion. And that is like this, moving the camera, but fast that way. Keeping the camera parallel to the subject field. Keeping the camera parallel to the subject field, but moving it fast. Then I go here, and now, instead of moving the camera parallel to the subject field, I'm panning like this. And when you're panning using a kind of a wide angle lens, you're much more likely to get this curvature of the field like that. So panning while using a long shutter speed is much more likely to give you curved lines in your pictures, whereas moving the camera in the truck type movement, and that comes from the truck expression comes from cinema, by the way. It's a characterization of moving a camera on a truck past a static subject. So now this is an Android camera or an Android phone. I'm using the camera in an Android phone. And this is a 2-second exposure. What? And look, there's no lines in it. There's none of those vertical lines in it anywhere. 2 seconds. There's some that kind of looks a little bit like vertical lines, but not really. We don't really see any of the vertical lines, the signature vertical lines. This has, I have a neutral density filter on the face of the camera, on the face of the phone, so that the light has been cut down tremendously. Because smartphone cameras have an aperture, one aperture only, and that's f1.8, I have to use a really strong neutral density filter. I'm going to make a change here again. So right here, this is the neutral density filter I'm using. It has an ND number of 1024, as opposed to the 5-stop, this 32, the one that I said is most versatile. Well, if you want to do these kinds of pictures with an Android phone, then you need something up in this neighborhood here, 10 stops of loss. And that means at f5.6 on a sunny day, I can go for at least 2 seconds, f5.6. So f1.8, of course, is a lot more than that. But the other thing is the smartphones, some of the smartphones can get down around ISO 8 instead of ISO 100. So that makes up the difference. The result is this is a 2-second exposure, with a smartphone. And that's the way it's done with Androids, because Androids don't have any apps that can do the long shutter speeds in daylight. And now 2 seconds, but now I'm really moving that smartphone fast across the scene. I'm moving it just about as fast as I can. And again, in a truck type motion, rather than a panning motion. I'm not panning, I'm moving in a truck type motion. And I got this, moving my hands just about as fast as I could. So I've been talking all about side to side movements. Well, you can also make vertical movements as well. And again, we're sticking with our trumpet vine here, a little bit of a vertical movement, kind of looks like flames and fire. So we abstract the flowers out to something a little bit more ominous looking. And this is a vertical movement. And again, this is a camera, and the shutter speed here is 0.4 of a second.
You know that we're still seeing your shutter speeds chart, not your image.
Oh, well, that's pretty smart. I apologize. I'll be right back. Let's see. New share.
That's better.
That's better.
Okay. So here are my flame type. Here are my flowers on the trumpet vine, and they're looking a little bit more like flames. And now we're moving the camera vertically instead. And again, there are two different kinds of movements, and that is keeping everything parallel, just moving the camera up and down, or tilting by twisting the camera like that. Okay, so you can tilt or crane. Okay. So this another one at 4/10 of a second. And we're staying with 4/10 of a second, backing off, backing away just a little bit, and moving the camera, starting at the top and moving down. I've got a blown out white sky here, a little bit of white sky. So I wanted to leave that in the picture to show you that if I put a white sky at the top edge of the frame, when I start to move the camera, when I start the exposure, then I'm not going to include any more of the white sky. And most of the time I want to avoid including any more of the white sky, because the white sky just bleaches everything out. But when you're using a vertical movement, a lot of times vertical subjects work a little bit better. So here we have a vertical part of the flower vine, a vertical vine, vertical arrangement. And this is just a regular picture. It's at a 2/50th of a second at f1.8, and this is with the iPhone. And so therefore, I'm using the iPhone app, the one that gave me all of those extra lines. Well, when I'm using the iPhone app and I'm doing a vertical like this, with this kind of a subject, a lot of those telltale lines are minimized. We see a little bit of it up in here. We see a few like this. Those are the lines that tell us we're used in order to imitate a long exposure. We're using many very short exposures sandwiched on top of each other like that. So that's the iPhone, and it's still an interesting picture. And looking at it too closely, looking at many pictures too closely ruins the picture anyway. So here is a camera in use. And what I did here, instead of moving the camera vertically, I have a vertical subject. So I moved the camera, I swept it to one side. So this is another sideways motion. And it smears everything to one side, as you can see. And this leaves a lot of the subject intact. One way to do that is when I start the exposure, this is a half-second exposure. When I start the exposure, I start with the camera still. And then as soon as the shutter opens, I move the camera. If the camera is still just for an instant, the briefest instant, right at the start of the exposure, we get to see some sharpness in the picture, and that rendered some of the flowers fairly sharply. Here we take the vertical approach, same thing, 4/10 of a second, and sweeping the camera up and down instead of sideways. And here, the camera is swept up and down, but really fast, much faster. It's the same shutter speed, 4/10 of a second, with the camera swept up and down in a vertical method, very fast. And again, this is the crane method, where the camera is kept steady, facing the subject, parallel to the movement. And rather than a tilt, instead of a tilt, this uses a crane movement, an elevator type movement, instead of a tilt. And so you wind up with more straight lines, gathering of straight lines like that. Now, another potentially excellent approach is to turn the camera, rotate the camera around the optical axis. You rotate the camera around the optical axis. I'm going to make myself a little bit bigger here. Like so. If I rotate the camera around the optical axis like this, I get a different kind of image altogether. So let's see if I can figure out the sharing this time. And that can produce a really lovely image. So does everybody see the flowers here?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So rotate once, rotate again. And as you can see, the subject right at the center of the rotation, right at the center of the image, with a careful rotation, the subject is recognizable. It remains quite recognizable. And then we have this, and this is my favorite picture of the day. Favorite picture of the trumpet vine this day. I've taken this trumpet vine several times, but this is probably my favorite picture I've taken of the trumpet vine. And once again, this is not a real long exposure. It's a half second. So, okay. That is the section on long exposure or intentional camera movement. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about intentional camera movement or any of the material that I've covered.
Do you ever twist the lens? Do you ever twist the lens?
Oh, to zoom it?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's another kind of intentional camera movement. And of course, that can produce some real interesting effects. You get a very strong sense of a tunnel, things zooming toward you or zooming away from you. I haven't done it in many, many years. I did it as a photojournalist for some special projects, for some fun pictures that we ran in the paper. But I certainly didn't do it for this session, and I thought about it, but I didn't get to it. But zooming is definitely a valuable intentional camera movement technique. Let's take a quick look. I'm sure we can get. I'm going to make a change here. Behind the scenes. If anybody is doing a behind the scenes video, it's not going to be very exciting, but so I'm logged in. So when you do a zoom, this is what you get, right? Yep. So the subject in the middle, subject right in the center of the frame doesn't seem quite so zoomed, but everything all around the subject definitely seems really zoomed. So, but there's the zoom effect. So I'm going to go back. Here's some really pronounced zoom movement blur. Oh, that's pretty interesting. Yep. Okay. So those are examples of zoom movement blur. Flickr is an amazing resource, flickr.com. You do not need to join Flickr in order to use it. It's just that when you go to the Flickr page and start searching for pictures, you get ads that you can skip past pretty quickly. They're not long movie ads or anything. It's just a sign comes up about an ad. So even if you're doing it anonymously, you can cruise through it and get some really good results. So I just typed in a search of ICM here, and here are some of the pictures that come back on ICM. Here is one where we've got a vertical movement, a vertical movement with trees. And this is very popular. Tree trunks are a very popular subject and can produce some really nice images in intentional camera movement. Terrific. Look at this. That's a wonderful picture. So intentional camera movement. And these are, so far, we've had those mostly were vertical camera movements. Here is a slightly horizontal or diagonal camera movement. Here is a combination of subject movement along with camera movement. So there's lots and lots of combinations. Now, this is something important to consider. If you're doing seashore intentional camera movement, or any other ICM picture where you have straight lines that you want to be straight and sharp, this is where a tripod comes in really handy. You set up the tripod so the camera is nice and level as you pan it, and then you set your shutter speed. What did this person use? Let's see. Okay, so the shutter speed was 1/13 of a second. 1/13 of a second at f8. As you can see, it's right at sunset there. So 1/13 of a second at f8 and ISO 100. ISO 100. 1/13 of a second, f8, ISO 100. So it's at sunset time, a little bit of sunlight left, and moving the camera very fast. 1/13 of a second usually isn't going to give you much blur, but this moved the camera fast enough so the photographer got the blur. Okay, other question?
I agree with you about when you have too much white in the scene, it really is hard to make it come out nicely.
Yes, yeah. There are some folks who really like to put buildings or a white, dark structures against a white sky and and then sweep the white sky down in front of the buildings when the picture is really underexposed. So let's see. I'm going to change this just a little. Oh. There, okay. Okay. I'd like to talk about multiple exposures. This is somewhat somewhat less interpretive on the part of the photographer. Many of the modern cameras, many of today's cameras and some of the older cameras have multiple exposure capability. And in the menu system in the camera, you find the multiple exposure and you set it to, from disable, you set it to enable. And once you've set it to enable, in some of the cameras, you get to choose what kind of multiple exposure combinations. How are you going to put the camera images together? Is it going to be additive, or is it going to be lighten or darken? Those are some of the choices. And then in the camera, you get to choose how many exposures you want to do, how many you'd like to do. And it can be, some of them are limited to 9, some of them are not limited to 9, they go up higher. So 2 exposures in this case here. Also, most of the cameras will give you a choice when you shoot the pictures. Do you want to save all of the pictures that you shoot? Or do you want to save the result only? I don't care about picture 1 + 2 + 3. I don't care about any of those. I just care about the combined picture, result only. Or no, wait. I want to keep picture 1 + 2 + 3. I want to keep all 3 pictures and I want the result. You can make that choice. Now, continue multi-exposure. No. I just want to do this one thing. I'm standing in front of this waterfall here, and I'm going to shoot a picture of it, and I'm going to shoot a multiple exposure, and then I'm going to walk away and I'm going to do other things. That's all I want to do is just this one sequence, 3 pictures or 2 pictures. I'm going to do a 2-picture additive composition, and I just want to do that one, and I'm going to walk away, and I want my camera to be in normal shooting mode. Well, 1 shot only. The other choice here is continuous. So you want to continue the multi-exposure? Yes, and you change to continuous. Most of the cameras that are offering multi-exposure offer that choice too. So here again, multi-exposure control, additive, where one picture just gets added onto the previous picture. So all of the bright areas get added onto the bright areas. All of the dark areas, anything in the dark area adds onto the dark area in the previous picture. Everything just stacks one on top of the other, adding more exposure every time you take a picture. Average, the camera knows how many pictures you're going to take, and it divides the exposure for each picture by the number of pictures you're going to take. Bright means all I'm going to do is use every time I take a new picture, I'm just going to use the brightest pixels in the picture to add on to the picture that I'm using, picture that I'm building. Dark, I'm just going to use the darkest pixels in the picture to add on to the next picture. So this is Nikon. Those were Canon controls. This is Nikon's control. As you can see, there's a multiple exposure choice. Do I want multiple exposure? I switch it on here. When I switch it on, I can choose 2 shots. Again, same overlay mode. Keep all exposures on or off. If I don't keep all exposures, all I'm going to keep is the result, just like Canon does it. In the newer Nikons, in addition, they give you overlay mode, which is just like the Canon set choices of overlay mode. So here now we have a picture, and the way this works, most of the time, the multiple exposures, many of the multiple exposures are used fairly simply with just a couple of images. And we start with an image like this of the trumpet vine and couple of the blossoms. And the next picture we take is just out of focus. We just set the camera so that it's out of focus. And then we combine them using an overlay mode that gives us a glow like this. Gives us a glow like this. So overlay modes. I'm going to make another switch here just to kind of illustrate something. So here's the original picture here. Here's the original. And here's the blurry picture. Here's the blurry picture. So when you are adjusting the pictures in the camera, some of the newer cameras give you also an opacity control, so you can determine whether this picture, whether the second picture and subsequent picture, whether that picture is 100% visible as it is here, or is it only partially visible, like so. And the overlay mode can also vary so that you get some very, very strange results. Very intense results. So here is a darken overlay mode, and here's a lighten overlay mode. Those are two overlay modes that you get in most of the cameras, darken and lighten. And of course, this is just a normal overlay right here and this is 100% opacity. And in the camera, you can change it to 60% opacity or whatever. So, and the question comes up often enough, well, that's so easy to do in software. Any photo editing program can do what I just did. Well, it's not the same. When you're out in the field and you're taking pictures and you want to create something, getting the instant feedback of seeing it on the back of your camera and creating something right there on the spot can be amazingly satisfying and motivating, and it can provide terrific incentive to keep you doing the things that you're doing. So another kind of multiple exposure is filling in a hole. So pictures that have holes in them, you might want to shoot a picture that has a hole in it. You might see a subject. Oh, isn't that pretty? Right? I'm not so sure about the background here, but the subject sure is pretty. How about if I find a more attractive background for it? Oh, like this. That, wouldn't it be cool to put that blossom in this hole right here? So you make a hole, or you find a hole that you want to fill with some subject. You find the subject that you want to put in there, and this is what you wind up with. One great big blossom in the middle of all of these tiny little blossoms here. Fun picture, certainly not botanically accurate, but a little bit of fun. Now, another way to do this, of course, is with smartphones, and a very good app, a really good app for doing it with smartphones is Snapseed. All one word, Snapseed, Snapseed. And this is what it looks like to do it in Snapseed. And actually, the processing that I'm about to demonstrate here is what it looks like when you start processing it in the camera also. These are the kind of steps that you have to go through in the camera. So I open Snapseed and it says to me, open a photo. So I look in my photos, and in fact, now this is kind of strange, new, actually not strange, but new. The Nikon the Z series cameras now offer users the ability to start a multi-exposure. When they want to start a multi-exposure, they can start it with any RAW file that is already on the camera card that's in the camera. Even if that RAW file was taken on another day, even if it's taken with a different camera of the same or similar model. So you can take a card out of one camera, one of the Z cameras, and put it in a different Z camera, and then start the multiple exposure processing, find the raw photo, the raw file that interests you, and then once you've found it, you put it in, you tell the camera, this is my starting point. Then every picture you take after that will be on that picture. So Snapseed opens, it says tap anywhere to open a photo. I open up my library of photos, and here's a silhouette that I shot just for this, a silhouette that I shot just for this. I choose that picture, and this is what it looks like when I open it in Snapseed. Okay, once I've got it open in Snapseed, I can then open the Tools menu at the bottom. And when I open the Tools menu, I can choose double exposure. As soon as I choose double exposure, I can then choose to add a picture. So it's saying add a picture. That's the symbol for add a picture in Snapseed. So when I go to add a picture, in Snapseed, you're not going to take a photo, but in Nikon and the other cameras, when you go to add a picture, that means you're going to take a picture. So here, add a picture. Okay, well, I'm going to add this picture here that I shot of the books. So once I add that picture, it looks like this. It looks like this. The default, the normal photo combination, blending mode, winds up with the picture looking like this. So then, using my fingers on the screen, I can stretch. I can spread my fingers to stretch the picture a little bit. And when I stretch the picture a little bit, the books get bigger. Wow. Okay, so I stretched the books so that they would get a little bit bigger. Now I can decide here is where I decide about the blend mode. What's the final blend mode going to be? And we see that it's now on default, and it can be lighten, just like in cameras, darken, add, subtract. They don't usually have subtract. Oops, sorry. They don't usually have subtract in the cameras, but they certainly have lighten, darken, and add. So I move to add, and when I move to add, all of the light values in the picture get added to the dark values in the original. Once the light values in the picture get added to the dark values in the picture, then the picture starts to become more clear what the picture is all about. It's this silhouette of a person with books inside. Then I can vary the opacity using this control here. And when I bring the opacity down, the books are darker. The books aren't quite as bright. Here they're very bright because they're very bright because the picture was quite light. If I bring the opacity of the books down, The books are darker. And now my picture really starts to look like what I wanted it to look like. And this suggests the lady of the house was really well educated and well read and had a wide range of interests. This is the library at the Patterson House that I was talking about a little earlier. And this is one of the docents. And I'm thinking of this docent as Clara Patterson, the matriarch of the family. And now it's time to export the picture. Of course, in cameras, you don't usually export the picture, but if you got a camera that's hooked up to Wi-Fi, and all the Z cameras are hooked up to Wi-Fi or to the internet, you can export the picture and load it up online right then. And with Snapseed, you can do the same thing. So I choose export, and then here are the different methods I can use to export the picture. So, and here are the two original pictures. Those are the basics of multiple exposure in camera. Multiple exposure in software, of course, is very, very similar, but has wildly more control. Wow, some people are still here.
Oh, yes.
Looking forward to playing this weekend.
Yeah, try out the stuff. I'm gonna use my
Yeah.
Snapseed.
Yeah, I've been trying
well,
some of those on our morning walk, and it seems to be a lot of fun because, you know, I'm trying to keep up with my wife because we're supposed to be walking for exercise, but, you know, to stop and take some and learn how those different modes of the way, whether it's average or they're darken, they're lighten, and it's fun to see how they work. And it takes a different kind of thinking. I find that I do one and I look at it and say, oh, that's not what I thought was going to happen. And so, it's a lot of fun anyway.
Yeah. What are you using, a camera or a smartphone?
Oh, I've got the Z6 II, the Nikon.
Yeah. Well, wow, that has some amazing controls in it.
Yeah,
the
so I'm
Z.
just kind of
Yeah.
learning those. So that's why I was, working with that and trying to,
Yeah.
learn how it works. And I think my D500 had some of those too, but this
Yes,
may
it
go
did.
a little
Yep.
further. Yeah.
Yep. Many of the Nikon many of the older Nikon cameras have that kind of stuff. Very few of the Canons, and a whole raft of Olympus cameras. There's a whole bunch of different Olympus models that are available really cheap that have very strong double exposure or multiple exposure capabilities. So Nikon has caught up to Olympus in a big jump with the Z cameras as far as that's concerned. And Canon is still kind of scratching their heads. I think they're still trying to figure out, do they want to commit to this or not?
I was glad to know that the Android phones have some tricks still, so.
Oh yeah. When I did the Android phone, with the neutral density filter, I actually did it just holding the neutral density filter pressed up against the face of the camera, just pressed up against the camera. No special equipment at all, nothing. I just pressed the filter up against the camera. Of course, I had to be careful to keep my fingers out of the way. that was the only problematic part. But yeah.
I don't know if you can see this because of my background, but I just got a DJI gimbal, and as you move it back and forth, it keeps the iPhone perpendicular to the subject. And it has controls on it, so you can tilt it down and tilt it up.
Yeah, you can just by using the device, you can control whether it's a truck or a pan,
right?
And you can control whether it's a crane or an or a tilt,
right?
So yeah,
and you You can change the orientation.
Yeah,
There's a mode to where you can do a slow spin as well.
yep, yes, yes.
Cool.
Some of those spins, if you tilt the gimbal forward, some of those spins don't have to be slow. They can spin the camera around pretty fast.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it has an extender on it to make it long, so you can wave the whole thing. You can get it down to your ankles and get very low upshots. I'm still exploring all the connections to the camera app, because I only got it a few days ago. But what one of my favorite movements in the past with Christmas lights is doing the truck move while moving the camera up and down as I move from one side to the other.
Yeah.
One of our old members used to do the Whaley wiggle. She would just
Yeah.
stand and shake her camera. It's pretty funny.
And she'd shake her hips.
Yeah. No, all of the movements that I illustrated were smooth movements, and there's nothing that says that you can't go back and forth during the exposure, or up and down, or twist this way. So, repeating the subject over and over by wiping it in two different directions. So there's nothing says you can't do that. And any movement that results in a worthwhile image is successful.
Yeah.
One photographer, I was watching one photographer, and his approach was just to do that, just flick the camera. And then he just flipped it right out of his hand.
Oh, oh no.
Oh, no.
Fortunately, he had his investment strap attached to the camera. So,
Yeah.
The one
But
where
yeah,
you
he
go
just-
up like that, the one where you go up like that, I've never tried that. Or the one where you're panning with the camera like that.
Mhm.
I haven't tried that. I've tried the rest of them, but not those. So that's gonna be fun.
That'll be fun to try.
okay. So,
Yeah.
when you move the camera this way,
Mhm.
panning, right? This is what you would
Get the curved
ordinarily
lines.
do for a panorama photo, if you're going to do a panoramic shot. So it's panning the camera. When you do that, the background behind us, you usually have foreground. You've got something in the foreground that's appealing to you. When you do this, the background behind the foreground, of course, changes radically, because different background,
Oh, yeah.
right? But when you do this, the truck motion, the background changes very little, because you're not looking over here at the background and then looking over here at the background.
Mhm.
So the background changes very little.
Makes sense.
I was working with the trumpet vine a little bit, and of course there's no background. It's just a vine on a wall. So I didn't have to worry about background at all.
Mhm.
And of course, when you do this, the principal concern you have is getting up into the sky.
Yes.
Yeah. So typically I will set the camera so that the sky is right there at the top of the picture, and then start the exposure and drop,
Mhm.
so that I don't include any more sky than is necessary.
Makes sense.
A comment I had, just thinking that you're talking about ISO 100.
Uh-huh.
Now with the new Nikon, and then also my D500, both allow you to go one full stop under. So
Yeah.
instead of being at 100, you're at 50. And
Yep.
I found that when I've tried some of these, that was helpful in slowing down that shutter speed.
You bet. Yep, that's a full stop. That's a full shutter speed, full 3 clicks on your shutter speed dial. Yeah. Mhm. That's
like
something
that.
else. Were you aware of that? You know, when you turn the dials for the aperture or the shutter, 1 click is 1/3 of a stop. 2 clicks, 2/3. So it's click, click, click. That's a full stop.
I believe in the menu, you can set that for a half a stop if you want.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how that works with other cameras, but both the Nikons, I have to do that.
Yeah, they all, well, I'm not familiar with any that don't.
Mhm.
I've seen it in Canon
Yeah.
and Sony, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, I prefer the third because sometimes you want that little extra. You want to keep something from being overexposed, but you want the whites white. And so it's kind of,
Yep.
it helps.
Greg's got something.
Yeah, I wanted to share that I discovered a motion effect when you use the HDR setting on your camera. So, I had a Nikon D750 and I was shooting in HDR. And I think that camera takes 3 photos very quickly and changes the settings between the 3 photos and then merges them together. And
Yep.
if you move while it's doing that, you get a blur.
Yeah, that's called a ghost. In HDR, that's called a ghost. And in some of the cameras, they have a de-ghost setting when you're doing HDR. But in all HDR software, there's a de-ghost setting that gets rid of things. Like the other day, I was shooting through a tree, through the branches of a tree, and the wind was blowing like crazy, very gusty wind, and the leaves were jumping all over the place. And so I set the de-ghost to very high, very, very strong. And it just picks one of the exposures it just picks one of the exposures and uses that one for the areas that are full of ghosting. So, but if you move the camera, then the whole picture kind of gets a ghost over it, and it might be a little more difficult to remove.
On the iPhone,
Fun.
if you shoot in live mode and make sure to save all the images, normally it would find the best, sharpest one. But if you save the other images, you get the ones that are blurred.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you can do fun stuff with them.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, thank you all very
That was
much. You've
fun.
been a real attentive group. Great questions. Wonderful comments afterwards. Wow, I like that a lot. So
Wonderful
you, Lynn.
program. Thank
Appreciate
you
it.
so much.
Yes,
you're
thank you.
welcome. Yeah,
Thanks a
you're
lot,
very
Len.
welcome.
Very informative.
Yeah,
And-
thanks.
Thank you.
Lynn.
All right.
And I will be in touch.
Okay, I'll look forward to it, and we're gonna get the SSL stuff straightened out, and I'll be a happy person, and so will Linda.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Bye,
Hi,
thanks
thank you.
again.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Are
Thank
we
you.
gonna meet now?
Good
or
night.
no?
No,
No,
Good night, y'all.
Good
night.
night.
happy shooting.